but he writes, how did nature fabricate the world's first digital information processor? The original living cell from the blind chaos of blundering molecules. How did the molecular hardware get to write its own software? These people realize the problem. They don't then go to the next logical step and say, aha! Where did DNA come from? It's very simple. If it requires intelligence to create information, there's nothing out there that screams more loudly than DNA made by God. Made by God. The information that's contained in there. So, we're moving our process here from the origin of basic molecules of life. Then we get to the problem of the cell, up a layer. There are there are cells without nuclei, and then there are cells with nuclei, and how did one evolve into the other? And the evolutionists have trouble explaining this without a lot of hand-waving. They cannot explain how cells without nuclei evolved into cells with nuclei. Then we go to another layer of complexity. How did a single cell entity form into multi-cell where the cells coordinate and can communicate information? You've probably heard of what are called stem cells, for example. And stem cells can form various kinds of other cells depending on what chemical and electric signals that are triggered to them. And so how did all that evolve by chance into multicellularly coordinated cells? Then we go up a layer. So assume that you have multicellular creatures. The next problem you have is how you take cellular division and now you go to bisexual reproduction forms. And even if a viable creature were to suddenly jump out in a new form, what's it going to mate with? How is it going to reproduce? And again, there's a lot of hand-waving on these problems. So we moved up from origin of information content in DNA to single-cell to multi-cell to bisexual reproduction, and then we get into all kinds of complex structures. Darwin himself, in his book, admitted that if you could show him a structure that couldn't have evolved through small single steps, then he would say that the theory of evolution doesn't work, or my theory absolutely breaks down. Well, Darwin's understanding of everything from the cell to the complexity of the human body, for example, was absolutely naive compared with what we know. He knew nothing about genetics compared to what we know, even though Mendel was already working on DNA. On genetics. He didn't know anything about DNA, which probably the information first became available in the 1950s. So he had no understanding of the complexity of life. And there are all kinds of things that they cannot explain. How eyes would form. So their idea is that light striking on a body over time, that light started to react and then eyes formed. And all of the different kinds of eyes, and how there are eyes of the same kinds in different creatures. They can't explain how feathers, according to an evolutionist, the scales of reptiles have evolved into feathers. The idea that a reptile, like a dinosaur, a small dinosaur, evolved into a bird. And the substance of which scales and reptiles versus feathers, they're so completely different. And how they evolved. Or the amniotic egg, and the egg of a amphibian, how it became the egg of a reptile, and how a bird egg forms. That process from amphibian to reptile to bird, and the eggs, very different eggs, for example. And how can a woodpecker bang its head against a tree and not get a headache? They can't explain these things. We move up in complexity in life. We move up to symbiotic relationships. This little dude right here is a Tasmanian skink. Snow skink. I don't know why it's called snow skink, but Tasmanian snow skink. Well, you can tell where he lives by Tasmania. And this is the honey bush. When the honey bush is in bloom, the Tasmanian skinks have to pull back these hard shells around the flowers. Then the flower will blossom, and then insects can come and do the pollination. If it weren't for these skinks, these plants could not reproduce. The two of them work together. There are hundreds of examples of symbiotic relationships in the world among animals or plants and animals. And again, evolutionists have a real challenge explaining this. For instance, one article in The Economist, he said, why did the honey bush evolve such a complicated procedure for its pollination? My friend, it didn't evolve. God created it in this form. One last example, and that is the theory of evolution in terms of languages. If you talk to most people, they would believe that languages all came from an original proto-linguistic form of grunts and signals. If you go to the Toronto Zoo, for example, and you see the chimps there or the gorillas, and they make noises and sound. Well, in theory, humans develop languages from that kind of communication. But the problem with this is that languages do not evolve from simple to complex. In fact, languages go from complex to simple. For example, in its structure, its grammatical structure, English is far simpler than Latin. Latin is an older language. Latin is simpler than Greek, and Greek is an older language. You go back to about 1500 and you get to Sanskrit, and it's an older language. This is in the Indo-European family of languages. And there's complexity built into these languages, and over time, languages are simplified. Just one example. We don't use thou and thee, and we don't use thou and thee very much anymore. It's going out of the English language. A few of us in church still might, but it's going out of the English language. Who and whom is disappearing. Languages simplify through time. They don't become more complex. Oh dear. Trying to connect to Wi-Fi. Did it show up there? No. Something showed up saying it was trying to download an update. So that we've seen that older languages are more complex, not less. So it's not an upward, it's a downward. And by the way, that's consistent with what Paul says in Romans, that all of creation is groaning and it's decaying, it's waiting for its redemption. Languages are decaying. Another problem is that for about a century, maybe more, they were attempting to find the original proto-language. In fact, what they've discovered is, at best, there's at least 50 different language families. Some languages are so different than all others that you can't connect them in at all. I won't go into a lot of detail on this in another presentation I have, but for example, some languages are based on clicking. That's how people talk, through clicks. So, very different forms. And what's interesting, if you look at the history of languages, a whole bunch of languages seem to suddenly appear around 2200 BC. Where do they all come from? Well, we have the answer in Genesis 1-11, the Tower of Babel. It tells us. The evidence supports the biblical account, not the evolutionary account. Fourth topic I want to mention is that the world is not billions of years old. The earth is not billions of years old. So there's a lot of accumulating evidence on this. This is fairly new research, but studies on mitochondrial DNA, and that's inherited only from the mother, but it is, the mitochondria take the energy from our food and convert it into energy that we can use. It's like all those windmills I saw out there driving up here. They can convert wind into electricity. Mitochondria take food and convert it into energy that we can use in our bodies. The studies that have been done on the Romanov family, where they were able to get, say, a hair sample from the Romanov family in Russia, or from the remains of Civil War veterans, and then taking it down to their descendants, they have found on these studies, and they were surprised at how the event of change, when they thought that there would be expecting about 600 generations, one mutation in every 600 generations, about 12,000 years. What they found was there was a mutation every 40 generations and one that would occur in 800 years. So the changes in the mutation in the mitochondrial DNA is occurring much faster than the evolutionists ever thought it would. And as a result, the change rate is far too fast to allow evolution to occur. And one of the scientists on this who was studying this, she said, oh, I went too far. She said, or the article noted, that the findings suggest that humans have been on the Earth for only about 6,000 years based upon the sequence. And then she says, but no one thinks that that's the case. Hello, I do. Humans have been on the Earth only 6,000 years. But the evidence says it, but they reject it, out of hand. And that was in, I have the article there. Oops, go back. It was in the journal Science, and Gibbons was the one who said that, made that statement. Another piece of evidence, and I'm just using a few examples here to show you that the world is not billions of years old. And this is genome decay. I just have to give a little background on this. This work was done fairly recently by a professor of genetics at Cornell University who became a Christian later in his life. And as a result of that, he changed his worldview, and he realized, and he's got a powerful book, and I believe we have some a copy of it, or a couple of copies of that downstairs if you're interested. It is a powerful example of how the evidence shows. And what he has shown is that mutations are coming in to the human genome, and every generation is introducing at least 100 and maybe as many as 300 mutations in every generation. Now, many of those mutations are just the equivalent of spelling mistakes. You can still read it. You can still understand it. But what's happening is that those mutations get carried to the next generation. And it's accumulated. And basically what this professor, Cornell University, geneticist, has argued is that the human life expectancy for across all generations is about 300 generations. At that point, and it's a rough calculation based upon the mutation rates, a baby that is born after the 300th generation would just be a monster, a defect, so defective that nothing could occur after that. Where are we right now? Approximately 200 generations since Adam, approximately. Things are accumulating and getting worse as time goes on. Not better, as the evolutionists argue. Another example, again, this is fairly recent material, but studies have been over 40 instances of fossils, and some of them have been found in Alberta. The fossils have been taken out. They still have material in them that is plastic, you can still have the soft tissue with cells, blood vessels in them. And if these bones were buried millions of years ago, like fossil bones for dinosaurs are supposed to be like over 100 million years ago they were buried. This organic material would long ago been decayed away. It's inconceivable that that material is still soft tissue. And when this particular woman was doing these studies and she opened up some of these fossils, it had the smell of death. It's like if a decaying animal. It was fresh, decaying animal. These bones were not buried millions of years ago. And again, this supports the biblical flood model. Another piece of evidence that the world is not millions of years old is the very fact that natural gas and oil, you drill a hole into the ground and it spurts up. The sandstone, the shale that it's in, is permeable, and over time pressure goes down. There would be no pressure there if it was buried millions of years ago. Here's another piece of evidence that goes against the world being millions. I think everybody's okay. Millions of years old is the magnetic force that we have surrounding our world and keeping it contained. And studies have been done where they've taken iron artifacts that were buried, say, by the Vikings or back 1,000 years ago, and the magnetic forces on those objects versus where the magnetism is today, and they're seeing that there's a dramatic decay in the Earth's magnet. We have a big giant magnet, and if you were to extrapolate, if we were to keep the rate constant, extrapolate the decay constant, extrapolate backward, if we went back just to 10,000 BC, the world would be such a magnet, it would be so hot that no life could exist. If you project it out the other direction, in 1,000 years, there will be no magnetism left on the Earth, and the Earth won't be protecting us, the magnetic force won't be protecting us from the cosmic radiation, and as a result, no life could exist on Earth. We are in that very key zone where we still have the protective force. Now, the evolutionists will claim that this is going to reverse. There's no evidence that it's actually turned around, that it's going to stop decay. And they have no scientific evidence, just their theory. And so, the world isn't really old, it's just tired. And this is what Paul tells us in Romans 8, 20 and 22. The whole earth is waiting for its redemption. It's groaning in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time, Paul said. So the real reason that the evolutionists want to have the world being billions of years old is not because of any evidence that it is billions of years old, scientific evidence, but because if the world isn't billions of years old, evolution will never work. That's the real reason. So, fifth topic I said we would cover is a quick view of some facts to support the biblical record of the flood. This is probably the biggest joke in the secular media, to think that there was a universal flood. And every few years somebody, the Globe and Mail or one of these Canadian papers will say, oh, evidence has been found in Anatolia or somewhere like that, and there was this flood, and it's probably where Noah got his account from. It's always a local flood idea. And there was an article just recently talking about the demise of, a sudden demise of vast amount of the animals on the earth. And they said that the article I was reading in the paper said it occurred in a 30,000 year space, and they attribute it to meteorites, or they attribute it to climate change, or to diseases, or volcanism, volcanoes, various things. The one thing they will not attribute it to is the global flood. Because the moment they do that, then they have to accept the Genesis account. And yet there is overwhelming evidence to support the global flood. And it's getting more and more powerful all the time. The mass extinctions. Local floods do not wipe out and create vast graveyards of fossil bones. The sediment layers that have been laid down in rapid succession on one another. Local floods just generally don't do that. And these are huge areas. They cover big swaths of North America and Europe. And if you put Europe and North America together, you actually see the strata going across. These are not local floods that have laid this down. The Grand Canyon, the river that runs through the Grand Canyon, the Colorado River, it cannot have carved that canyon. Rivers don't form the canyon. That canyon was formed while the sediment was still soft right after the flood. and massive amounts of water were draining off of North America into the new forming, I don't know if it was North America at that time, but the continental changes occurred. But it was draining off of the continent at that time into the new forming basins of the oceans as God was draining the water off the earth. Soft sediment layers, water just rushing through. The little Colorado River doesn't have the force to move boulders and carve out the canyon. But you take a huge amount of water covering the continent wide, and as it rushes off into the new forming oceans, it carves the canyons. Mount St. Helens, which is in observable historical time, because it occurred in the 1980s, gives us an illustration on a small scale of the kind of thing that could have happened during the flood. The canyons that were formed suddenly through the soft sediment layer, within 5 years, those sediment layers that were formed were starting to form into rock. And so by studying it and what's happened there, it's actually given us a good small laboratory case study that provides a lot of evidence for the support of the flood model. Another key aspect is in this rapid sedimentation is that in these sediment layers there's footprints, there's raindrops, there's ripple marks. This means that the next sediment layer had to be put down extremely fast, and it had to be put down gently. Many of the cataclysms wouldn't have put it down gently, but if you have these currents washing back and forth in the oceans, carrying sediment and laying them down one on top of the other, you get a different model out of this. The fossils that have been formed, for instance, this is a dolphin-like creature, and it's actually giving birth, and it will snap like that into a fossil, and there's no decay. Soft body parts have been fossilized. In the fossil layers, you go and look at the Grand Canyon, and each layer is perfectly smooth on top of the other. There's no evidence of erosion. If these layers were laid down millions of years apart, there should be evidence of erosion and of soil being formed. And yet one sediment layer is laid down on top of the next. Another example of this sediment layer is laying down strata where you might have an organic layer, which is coal, followed by a sand layer, followed by another organic layer, and then you might have a shale layer, and all these layers are being laid down one on top of the other, and there's a tree going right up through it, and there are hundreds of these examples. This cannot be the result of millions of years of sediment layer. The irony on this is when they do a radiocarbon dating on the coal layers, they get a very different date than when they try to get a date out of, say, the granite or the shale. They can't use radiocarbon on them, but they use other techniques. They were all laid down in sequence. There's so much other evidence, I cannot go into it today, but soft sediment formation. Rock doesn't fold, but if it's soft sediment, it will fold and bend, and then it will harden into rock. The formation of water gaps, massive amounts of water. The formation of mesas and buttes and spires. And a lot of this evidence in geology is quite new. It's been in the past decade or two that's showing that these things are the result of the flood and not what the evolutionists would say. So we are presenting here that creation is history. It is what God has told us how the world came into it and into existence, how life came into existence, and it is consistent with scientific evidence. And this is where Peter says, therefore, honor Christ and be prepared to make a defense for what you believe. But he says, you notice, that you're to do it with gentleness and with respect. And so he is giving us how he's encouraging us to be prepared to defend the views we believe in. Now, how can we do this? One of the ways is to use Creation Magazine. And if we could just pass those clipboards around, there's 2 sets going up. If you're interested in subscribing to Creation, we like to get the congregation before everybody exits, because some people won't come downstairs and look at the books. So if you're interested in subscribing to Creation, you can fill it in. You can still fill it in downstairs. We have those. And the other one that's going around, there are 2 clipboards. The other is if you're interested in subscribing to our weekly web mail out. and we send out an update once a week. And so the Creation magazine is really, really good. It covers topics. I'll show you some of this is the commercial part, by the way, the advertising. We have examples here of the kinds of studies. Here's the one about polystrate fossils up to the sediment layer. Starlight and time. One of the questions, and this is a topic I'm quite able to answer, but it's a lot of fun, is how can we see stars if they are 13 billion years away and the universe is only 6,000 years old? There's good explanation. So there are answers to these kinds of questions. These are some examples. So these are the forms that we're passing around. If you're interested in subscribing, it is well worth it. I have a subscription for our church. I read it and then I put it in our library. And I mentioned my grandson Noah. I sent him a subscription to it and he loves it. And he's only in grade 6. It's a level that's above it, but he's a pretty smart kid because he's my grandson. But he loves it. So it's well worth getting a subscription to it. We have faith building pack. There's a book, and we have these downstairs. There's Christianity for Skeptics, which is written by people in our team, and it is an apologetics approach. And it deals with other religions, it deals with the existence of God. And then there's the one I mentioned that where we answer lots of questions, and this focused more on answering the questions that young people might have. And again, written by CMI team. Then there's another one which is dealing by PhD scientists who are dealing with Achilles' heels of evolution. And there's a DVD that accompanies it. One of our prime speakers, he has written a commentary on Genesis, and it is quite good, and we have copies of that downstairs if you're interested, and Genesis 1 to 11. And we have a booklet that covers the same types of topics for young people called 6 Days. And then there's a set for children, and young children, and then there's a whole series of DVDs. We've got all kinds of DVDs. By the way, if you subscribe today to the Creation magazine, we give you a copy today, then you get your 4 issues a year, and we give you a free DVD to go with it. You can pick any of the ones you want that have the CMI logo on them. We have all kinds of material that is available. There's this kit down there, we have them, and there's over $300 worth of material all bundled up in solo wrap, buying quantity, and you get lots of good stuff. And when Richard, our president of CMI for Canada, he says it's one of the easiest websites to remember. It's creation.com. If you can't remember that, you've got a problem. It's the easiest one to remember. Creation.com, and we've got all kinds of good stuff there, and it's all free. We have thousands of articles on the site. We have the broadcasts, and Richard has a fantastic studio in Kitchener, and they put together shows, and they run from about 10 minutes to 30 minutes, and there are hundreds and hundreds of really good,